Welcome everyone to Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring you interesting and timely information. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session, Navigating Sponsorship Challenges. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly training sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsored resettlement agency staff, refugee paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality sponsorship programs across the United States. Just for housekeeping, as a reminder for everyone joining us today, there is a control panel in your upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be a time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is going to be automatically muted. However, if you have any technical issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the question box and we can assist you. Additionally, the presentation and any resources and a recording will be sent to everyone following today's webinar. And this brings us to our presenter today, Katie. She is CWS Private Sponsorship Coordinator. Katie, thank you for joining us today and please take it from me.
Thanks, Joy. Hey, everybody. I'm Katie Randall. Like Joy mentioned, I'm the Private Sponsorship Coordinator here at Church World Service headquarters, and I'm very happy to be with you today and talking about navigating sponsorship challenges. So we can go on to the first slide. Beautiful. Most of you are familiar with Church World Service, I'm sure. We are a faith-based organization transforming communities around the globe through just and sustainable responses to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. I came to CWS in the beginning of the Afghan Placement Assistance Program in fall 2021. Prior to that, I had spent 5 years on the board of directors with a co-sponsorship group in Virginia. We were semi-remote. We were about an hour away from the local resettlement agency, so we were doing quite a bit of the hands-on work there. I also led the healthcare team lead. I provided healthcare coordination support for a number of Syrian and Afghan families that we had co-sponsored, and then also trained other volunteers on our healthcare team. So that's how I came to CWS. And now I work in supporting groups who are welcoming Ukrainians through Uniting for Ukraine, folks welcoming through processes for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and will now soon be helping groups supporting newcomers through the Welcome Corps program. And we can go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so goals for this call today for the meeting is to learn about common challenges of sponsorship and then be introduced to proactive and reactive solutions to those challenges with the ultimate goal of preventing sponsorship breakdown. And when we talk about sponsorship breakdown, we're referring to a point in the sponsor-newcomer relationship where neither feels comfortable going forward with that relationship anymore, and sponsors back out of that sponsorship, or newcomers say, I no longer feel comfortable working with that sponsor. So we want to address these challenges and find strategies to address them so that we can make sure that that relationship continues in a productive way. Next slide, please. We often see sponsorship through rose-colored glasses, and for good reasons. It's very fulfilling. It facilitates community integration. It strengthens communities. All of these things are very true, and I'm sure most of us on the call know this from personal experience. But what we also know is that sponsorship is also very difficult and comes with its own challenges that need to be addressed so that those more positive outcomes can happen. So risks and challenges in sponsorship can include sponsorship breakdown, which I talked about, strain on staff in a co-sponsor relationship when you're working alongside staff to provide core services. Sponsorship breakdown or difficulties with sponsorship put more strain on the staff member who is in that partnership as well. There can be a lapse in service delivery and a risk of newcomers falling through the cracks and not getting the support they need to work towards self-sufficiency in the United States. And then, of course, delays in self-sufficiency for newcomers, which is especially difficult when you're already in such a limited window, that 90-day reception and placement window for newcomer services. So the risks of those challenges going unaddressed can lead to snowballing problems for newcomers who are establishing themselves in the United States. Next slide, please. There are often a lot of expectations that we have going into sponsorship that don't always meet up with the reality of resettlement. So when I work with sponsors, sometimes there's an expectation of gratitude from newcomers. Going kind of back to that rose-colored glasses that I mentioned earlier, folks are very excited to do this incredible thing, and it is an incredible lift for volunteers and for sponsors. It involves a lot of work, a lot of networking, a lot of building on community engagement and connections that already exist. It's a very personal and emotional process. And there's this expectation that when someone comes, they will be overwhelmingly grateful, you'll be best friends immediately, there'll be this amazing bond, and that will get you through all the difficult parts of sponsorship. The reality of that is that there's often, actually, before I do that, let me go through all the expectations, because the realities address all of those at once. There's also this expectation of a very smooth transition into the United States. Volunteers sometimes feel like, okay, we're going to help them with everything. They're safe now. They're in the United States. They're going to come, and all their problems are going to be fixed. Everything's going to be so much better for them. They're going to have this sense of safety and security, knowing that they're here now. And any trauma that they had before, they won't have to deal with that anymore. The realities of this, of course, are that the sponsor and newcomer relationship is unequal from the beginning. I will say this multiple times through this presentation, but refugee newcomers don't choose to be in this relationship and scenario, but resettlement volunteers do choose this. Sponsors do choose to be in this relationship, and that just out of the gate is an unequal situation. And what I remind sponsors is to not then put that burden of gratitude and that expectation of gratitude on someone who, in a relationship where you chose to be there, but that person would not have chosen to be in this scenario, are in that scenario, in that relationship, under very dire circumstances. And of course, newcomers bring trauma, both from displacement, which we understand is a trauma. There's a lot of trauma involved in displacement, but there's also trauma involved in resettlement. There's a lot of adjustments happening all at once. And so adjusting to life in the United States can be in itself its own trauma that is often, that we often overlook when we're thinking about what this experience is like for newcomers and how sponsors should react to that. Of course, that trauma brings a lot of its own emotions and a lot of reactions and a lot of other processes that sponsors need to be sensitive to. And then also cultural differences in relationship building. People have different ways that they become friends with people, different ways that they build that rapport and that relationship. And, refugee newcomers are coming to this having had a much different lead up to arrival in the United States than sponsors did, where sponsors have been building this momentum, getting excited, getting their communities excited. And, newcomers have not had, they have had a very different experience on their end. So important in that sponsor relationship to align expectations among the group early on, even before a newcomer arrives, so that out of the gate we're making sure that we're in touch with the realities of the situation and not setting too high of an expectation for what that sponsor newcomer relationship will look like. And the realities, if you're not prepared for them and they're not expected, that can also obviously lead to difficulties in that relationship, especially after that honeymoon period. Sometimes those first couple weeks there's a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm over checking tasks off and getting them enrolled in benefits and getting things done. And then after, that 3 or 4 week mark, sometimes things that were small annoyances or small challenges in the beginning, if left unaddressed, have now become kind of bigger problems, and sponsors can become increasingly resentful. Newcomers become increasingly frustrated. So it's, like I mentioned, good to align those expectations early on. And next slide, please. So now let's talk about some common challenges. And after you're done listening to me talk, I would love to hear about some of the challenges that you all have experienced or are worried about experiencing. So we often have sponsors who are unprepared for newcomer self-advocacy. Many newcomers are very, very good at advocating for themselves, asking for what they need, making sure people know that those problems exist, and they keep that on the radar, that I am having this issue and I need it addressed. I am here, I am struggling in this way, or this is a situation I need fixed. That is a skill that is very good to have in the United States, to advocate for yourself, but sponsors sometimes struggle when that skill is turned towards them. They're generally not fans of being on the receiving end of it. They see it as complaining. They see it as newcomers being ungrateful. And this leads to that resentment that I mentioned among sponsors and volunteers. Volunteers become less willing to work with newcomers who they perceive as ungrateful. When they're on the receiving end of that self-advocacy, they're often taken aback. Like I mentioned, their expectations aren't quite aligned with what the reality of the situation might be. And their own disappointment about this relationship being very different than what they expected can make them take things more personally, even than they may have otherwise. This also may look like newcomers expressing their own agency. They may choose not to go to English language classes. They may choose to not do things that, they may not want to go to the park with volunteers or with the sponsor group. They may not want to do certain outings or certain things that the sponsor was expecting that they would want to do and had arranged for them. And that also can come across as being very ungrateful to sponsors, and again, taking that personally, and that becomes a challenge in that relationship. Another big challenge that we see is over-involved volunteers. And this, of course, comes from the most well-meaning place in the world. Everyone involved in this is doing it because they genuinely want to help. They want to make a difference. They want to be there and be that support system for newcomers. But sometimes volunteers in sponsor groups and sponsors become over-involved. They won't allow any consequences to happen for newcomers. And when I say consequences, it can be as simple as, missing a doctor's appointment, or a child not being able to, purchase a yearbook or something like that. Really minor things, anything that they see as potentially being a small challenge for a newcomer, they want to do everything possible to make it easy for them. And we understand this instinct when you have someone who's experienced a lot already of especially a lot of negative things. You want to jump in and keep them from having to experience any other negative consequences. And this often leads to micromanaging, especially if there are kids involved. I see this with sponsors quite a lot, where they are like, well, I have to do this because otherwise the kids won't get their homework checked. And I have to communicate directly with the teacher because the parents aren't quite at the point where they can do that. So I need to do it. I need to be there involved. I need to be stepping into that relationship. And that this often then leads to these really entangled relationships where sponsoring gets conflated with parenting, or becoming, establishing this sort of pseudo-familial relationship that can often lead to sponsors. And I'm using sponsors and volunteers kind of interchangeably here, but what I mean is members of the sponsor group. It can lead to them really overstepping, and again, leading back to newcomers potentially becoming resentful, sponsors not knowing how to disentangle themselves, disengage, and getting in the way of newcomer self-sufficiency because they have tried to do everything for them to prevent any sort of hardship or difficulty. Another challenge that we have sometimes is delays in services. This involves, government processes, which we all know can really take a bit sometimes. Sometimes you have employment authorization that's delayed or benefits are delayed, and that the frustrations over that can sometimes be taken out on sponsors. If there is frustration that may be directed at sponsors, especially if you have newcomers that aren't as familiar with the way things go in the United States, the red tape, the bureaucracy, the forms, and the sponsor is their point of contact for those things. Not point of contact, but they're sort of established person, their liaison, and so they may take out some frustrated feelings. And you may have sponsors may be on the receiving end of that, and so explaining. Oh, yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. We have some solutions in the next slides, but these are the challenges. Sponsors sometimes also are in a position, particularly those who are co-sponsoring with a local office, sometimes in the situation where, they are, case managers have a lot of families they're working with, and sponsor may just have 1 or 2 families that they're working with. And so they are able to address needs in different ways than case managers are able to. And so sometimes sponsors wind up taking sides, right? They'll side with a newcomer and say that staff aren't addressing certain needs, or they'll side with staff and tell newcomers that they aren't showing enough appreciation, or they aren't just need to wait. And sort of do that in a kind of dismissive way, which isn't productive for anybody in that relationship. Sponsors also struggle sometimes with what they perceive as awkward topics, things that are awkward, especially in the United States, to talk about, that include money and parenting and hygiene. Trust me, I am in that boat as well, or because they really just don't have any other volunteers in their sponsor group who can do that. This often leaves newcomers without long-term sustainable support when you have those core volunteers who do a lot at the beginning, they do a lot all at once, and then they burn out and they're not able to sustainably support that relationship going forward. Next slide, please. So there are 2 different ways to approach solutions to these challenges. And one is proactive solutions, and then one is reactive solutions. Proactive solutions come before the challenge arrives. Reactive solutions happen after the challenge, in the thick of it, so to speak. After the challenge has presented itself, then you have a reactive solution to figure out what to do with that challenge. So first we will talk about proactive solutions on the next slide, please. All right, so some proactive solutions to these common challenges that I've mentioned. What we consider a pre-arrival solution. Before you welcome a newcomer, before the sponsor relationship really begins in earnest, is having really robust training about refugee agency. Our Refugee Welcome Collective team has developed a really excellent training called Community Sponsorship Essentials. And there is training in there both for co-sponsors working in office, welcome core groups, and also folks welcoming through sponsor circles or welcoming humanitarian parolees. And this training talks at length about refugee agency and respecting refugee agency. And so for sponsors and for sponsor group leaders, you know, when CWS works with sponsor groups, we require that at least one person in the sponsor group has taken this training, but we really recommend this for any member of the sponsor group or volunteer for the sponsor group who is going to be working with newcomers, because it does such a good job of talking about managing expectations among the sponsor group, and has really great sections where you're actually supposed to take a question from the training and talk about it with your sponsor group. And there's a specific prompt for that. And that goes a long way with establishing expectations among the sponsor group members so that those can be aligned and everybody can be on the same page before things even begin. Also, in terms of recognizing newcomer agency, recognizing that anything offered should be offered with no strings attached. Going back to the discussion of that unequal relationship right out of the gate. I had a situation in my sponsor group once where someone very kindly donated brand new bikes for everyone in the family. And then those bikes were frequently left out in the rain and, you know, not locked up and left lying down in the grass. And one of the challenges that came up in our group was that one of our group members felt that this behavior should be corrected. That it was something that needed intervention, that someone should tell the family that the bikes couldn't be left out and that they were being really ungrateful and that wasn't going to work. And, you know, remembering that any gift offered should be offered freely, just like in any other relationship or scenario, and recognizing that people have the agency to do with the things that they have, you know, what they will. And understanding that as an expression of agency, not as an expression of disrespect. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but not taking things personally and making sure to approach it as like, this is a full human being that has their own choices and agency. And this is not meant as a personal slight against me. So aligning expectations among the group for, you know, if we're going to do this, we're going to do this without expecting anything from this newcomer that we're welcoming, so as not to add that additional burden on that relationship. We do it because it's the right thing to do, not because we are needing to intervene if something isn't treated the way that we expected or something like that. Recognizing that newcomers are processing trauma, and like I mentioned before, they have survived by being firm advocates for themselves, and that is a skill to be cultivated and that is valuable, and that's a positive skill. But reminding volunteers during that training process and sponsors during that training process that is maybe something that happens that's directed towards them, and recognizing that that's valuable. So one thing that I have done with sponsor groups is reminding them that we can validate feelings while also setting boundaries. You know, saying like the bike scenario, you know, we're not able to provide, you know, let's say the bikes were left out in the rain and they rusted, and it was we now need new bikes. A good way to set a boundary as a sponsor group is to say, you know, we're not able to provide anything else right now, but we're able to, we can help you work it into a budget for after you've been working for a while. So setting that boundary of, we don't expect you to treat this in any certain way. We don't expect anything out of this gift or this work that we're putting in, but we do have boundaries about what we're able to do if, you know, if this isn't something that you want, or if something happens to this, we're no longer able to provide additional support in that way. So that's really helpful to talk about as a sponsor group, to figure out where your boundaries will be as a sponsor. What support will you be able to provide above and beyond those core services that you are, of course, committing to provide? Most sponsors do go above and beyond in that way. And sometimes, because it's not clearly written on that core services list, sometimes the above and beyond things really become where those challenges happen. because it feels like an extra. And that's when people start to not set as good boundaries about what they're willing to do, and what the limits of their sponsor group are, where the limits of their sponsor group are. And this also helps avoiding micromanagement. Like we talked about on the challenges slide, setting good boundaries also includes, okay, if someone isn't, if there's an English language class that starts at 9 a.m. and the father of the family has said that he wants to go to this English language class. Sometimes, let's say in the scenario that the sponsor has arranged for this class, it's not being offered through a resettlement agency office. We have some sponsors who are farther away and aren't able to utilize office services. So they've gone out of their way to arrange this 9 a.m. class, and the father of the family says he wants to go, but he is not awake at 9 a.m. when the class starts, and that happens frequently. A micromanagement approach would be to go wake him up every day, to say, okay, we have set up this class for you. You need to make sure that you're going. And we don't want to do that. That makes challenges harder, not better in my experience. So we want to be able to set good boundaries about, okay, this is what we're not going to do if this happens. We will say that, okay, we're no longer going to be able to provide transportation to the English language class, because volunteers aren't able to come if you're not willing to go. So that would be an example of setting a boundary rather than micromanagement. We also have another micromanagement approach is volunteers making all these appointments so they don't get missed, checking kids' homework every day. And again, like I mentioned before, this often doesn't set folks up for long-term success. It sometimes exacerbates or creates challenges because volunteers have inserted themselves in places, and sponsors have inserted themselves in places that weren't appropriate for them to be. So setting very good boundaries among the group about what you're willing to do and what you should do, respecting that agency, is very important as a proactive solution. There's also another part of that is the unclear financial support that often comes with aligning expectations and defining relationships. Want to align those expectations early and not be afraid to have uncomfortable conversations about financial support. Really important to communicate exactly what kind of support your group is prepared to offer, so there are no surprises. Again, that there's that 90-day expectation of core service delivery, but many sponsors provide ongoing support in some capacity. And so figuring out, are we going to pay rent for another 3 months? Are they going to be able to live in the parish house for another year? Figuring out what that ongoing support looks like so that you can continue to align expectations going forward. Defining relationships is a big one for a proactive solution. And this is often one that sponsors aren't prepared for because you have this idea of what that relationship will be, right? Like we talked about at the beginning. But then when folks come, for some sponsors, it becomes very easy to slip into almost a parenting role. I've had sponsors say that their relationship with a newcomer was like parenting a teenager. And trying to get someone to do things they don't particularly want to do, or trying to teach them the skills they need before they go to college and they're independent. And this is a relationship metaphor that we grab for as sponsors because we don't really know how to articulate. We don't have another framework to pull from. But as you might imagine, pulling from that framework and acting as if a sponsor is a parent or needs to be paternalistic in that way, often muddies a relationship in a way that is hard to disentangle later. And again, doesn't lead to long-term success and can increase the risk of challenges, of hurt feelings, of resentment, and ultimately of sponsor breakdown. You think like, I'm gonna approach this. I'm gonna be so close to the project that it's gonna feel like a familial relationship. It's gonna feel like parenting. And you think that will make you, that will alleviate certain problems. But again, in my experience, it actually increases challenges for all parties involved. And then working alongside staff where applicable. If you're in a co-sponsor relationship, I had mentioned with the challenges, it's sometimes very easy when you have staff and you're working with newcomers and you as a co-sponsor want to kind of take sides and advocate for newcomers with staff who you feel aren't fulfilling their end of the arrangement. But this also kind of taking sides and saying that the staff member that you're partnered with and working with isn't doing their job also is not productive in avoiding challenges. Each of you in this relationship has a different role that you're fulfilling, and staff bring an incredible amount of expertise to this relationship, and sponsors are able to provide a lot of really great on-the-ground support that staff may not otherwise have the capacity to do. And maintaining that relationship is very important. And so using some good conflict resolution and making sure to discuss boundaries and expectations. I love boundaries and expectations, y'all. You're going to hear me use those words. You already have, but you're going to hear me keep using them because I like them so much and they're so good for navigating challenges. But talking about boundaries and expectations with staff so that you can all work together effectively is so important in preventing sponsor breakdown and these other challenges that we've been talking about. Also, for avoiding sponsor burnout, having a robust volunteer base is so important. And some people do this, they do this different ways. You can have a first shift of volunteers who can do the high intensity tasks of the first few weeks. And then you have reserve volunteers who can step in after that point if your sort of first shift of volunteers feel like they're getting burned out. What we want to avoid is having like I mentioned, that 2 to 3 volunteers who are doing everything themselves. Some groups have different kind of tiers of support. So they'll have 4 or 5 main group members who do all of are the kind of the primary family liaisons. They sort of are managing the sponsor group overall. Maybe you have another level of volunteers that are doing 1 to 2 hours a week for transport and tutoring. Level 2, maybe 3 to 4 hours a week, or 3 to 5 hours a week for more involved help, maybe cultural orientation and training. Maybe level 3 is 6 to 10 hours a week. And these are the folks who are doing a little bit more involved and doing a little bit more of the okay, we need to learn how to call the doctor's office, and I can spend 2 or 3 hours at the house walking through making a phone call and what to expect, things like that. So having different opportunities for volunteers to be involved that doesn't involve just those 2 to 3 main people doing everything. Delegating responsibilities, and again, good boundaries are key to avoiding sponsor burnout. Be willing to let newcomers struggle productively. Resist the urge to solve every problem right away. And this is a key one, is spend more time teaching skills than doing tasks. I always recommend for sponsors to be tutors and guides and, like kind of cultural orienters, rather than people who are just going to see a need and just immediately address it. We want long-term skills rather than immediate solutions to problems where there may be some room for some productive struggle in there. Volunteers and sponsors who are used to being high achieving in their own careers or anything like that may struggle to delegate responsibility to other volunteers because they have a right way of doing things in their mind, and they don't always trust other people to do it the same way they would do it, the right way. But having tasks done in different ways, and maybe not the same way that you would do it, as long as it's still aligning with your group's goals and expectations and boundaries overall, is better than somebody trying to do it all themselves and burning out and ultimately having to back completely out of that sponsor relationship. And then regularly pointing back to training and those expectations and boundaries that you set at the beginning. It's very easy for people to forget over time. Even if they did the trainings at the beginning, after a month, they may have forgotten a lot of that. So having, for sponsor group leaders, touching base with the rest of your sponsor group being able to point back to that is really useful and effective in reminding people about where those boundaries and expectations are. All right, and next slide, please. All right, and so our second approach is reactive solutions. And as a sponsor, you will utilize both proactive and reactive solutions. We can't prepare for every possibility of challenge. There will be challenges. I warn sponsors of this. You can do 1,000 hours of training, and there will still be inevitably some challenge you could not have anticipated that will come up. And you will need to have a good strategy for a reactive solution on deck that you can implement. A big one is utilizing professional interpretation when there's conflict. A lot of sponsors rely on volunteer translators who are an amazing help and so valuable in the sponsor process. But when there's conflict, you really want to make sure things aren't being lost in translation. So utilizing paid interpretation when possible. Having an in-person conversation when needed, when there's conflict, when there's challenges, not doing things over WhatsApp put through Google Translate, right? Having an in-person conversation with a professional interpreter can be really valuable when a conflict arises. And then preparing sponsors and volunteers in your sponsor group for to have cultural humility in these conversations. There are some languages, we saw this a lot during the Afghan placement assistance program, where some languages sound more harsh to people who only speak English. And this is an example that came up quite a few times, where it may feel like someone speaking Dari in a passionate tone is angry at you as a sponsor. And usually in these circumstances, they weren't angry. It's just that they were speaking a language that sounded different. The tone of the language to the English-speaking volunteer sounded more aggressive than what they were used to. And this is of course a big cultural difference that can easily, you can see how that could easily escalate hurt feelings and these challenges unnecessarily when there wasn't that happening at all. That was just a volunteer reading into a situation. So my suggestion with that is to not read too much into like tone or volume. This is what I remind sponsors. Engage only with what's being expressed, recognizing that nuances are often lost in translation. And again, going back to not taking things personally in these scenarios. Yes, that was my next point. Managing your emotions as a sponsor. And when I say a lot of this, I'm really talking to sponsor group leaders, the people who are doing sort of the primary, the work of organizing and leading their sponsor groups. And these are good reminders to funnel down through the rest of your sponsor group. And again, I know we talked about this already, but remembering that you have chosen as a volunteer and as a sponsor to show up to this relationship in a certain way. And meanwhile, the newcomer you're welcoming has been through a lot of different scenarios that they did not necessarily choose to be in, including being resettled in a particular location, in a certain apartment with a certain sponsor. So recognizing that that is the framework of your relationship and remembering that you have chosen to be here. And then using the proactive solution to guide the reactive solution. So pointing back to those expectations and boundaries that your group set regarding the support offered and what you are able to offer. And this is applicable to both sponsors and newcomers. You may have situations where newcomers are asking for things that you're not able to provide because that's a boundary that you set as a group. And so having established those proactive solutions and establishing those boundaries and expectations early on gives you something to point back to, where, at the beginning, we talked about what we're able to provide as a sponsor, and we told you, or we had discussed or decided that we're not able to do this XYZ thing. This would fall under that parameter, and so we're not able to do this, but we can help you set figure out how to reach this goal on your own, or we can talk about where you would need to be financially to be able to do this, and then offering kind of an alternate pathway out of that challenge that does align with your group's expectations and boundaries. Next slide, please. I know I've mentioned a few scenarios throughout, but I wanted to provide a scenario that did come up very frequently during APA, and I mentioned a little bit of this at the beginning. You and your group are expecting a family of 5 to arrive at the end of the week. This has been a fast turnaround, but your group located a 3-bedroom apartment and rallied a group to come together to build beds, set up furniture, run to the store for groceries, and you consulted with a local Afghan family to place some decorations in the home that you think the family will appreciate. When the family arrives, you're excited to show them the space. There aren't many smiles though. In fact, the next day, it appears that the family is going to throw out some of the decorations, and you are approached by the father who asks when they can move to a new home. Group members are frustrated, hurt, and now you need to reply to both the concerns of the family and concerns of your group members. This was a situation that was very common, and has been very common with sponsors. And again, it's that excitement that the volunteers and the sponsor have been doing on their end and all the work that's gone into it, and they're very emotionally attached to the work that they're doing. And this is an example of how not aligning expectations among the sponsor group can lead to a lot of initial disappointment. This is a good moment to point volunteers back to what I mentioned earlier about not expecting a certain emotional reaction from newcomers when they arrive here to a situation that they didn't necessarily choose to be in. And then reminding volunteers that the reaction of the newcomer in this scenario, doesn't negate the hard work that was put into the apartment, that was put into getting the furniture. Just because it wasn't received the way that a sponsor may expect doesn't mean that the sponsor has done anything wrong. The sponsor did all the right things. And now the newcomer has their agency over their space and their belongings and are able to do with that what they will. Maybe they had, they previously had bed bugs from used furniture and they're uncomfortable with used furniture in the apartment. Or maybe they were used to a higher quality of apartment, and now in the United States, this is what would fit into the budget as expected. But that doesn't take away from the hard work that the volunteers did to arrange for those things. And this is where good boundaries come in. So in my experience as a sponsor, I would explain to newcomers that they are absolutely free to keep or discard or replace any items that they want. And that is completely up to them. However, we as a sponsor group wouldn't be able to provide any other furniture items or any new furniture items, or provide a different apartment. What we can do is work with the newcomer towards financial goals that could include a new place to live or new furniture, but also making sure to say and align that expectation of it may take some time of building, of working and growing an income before those goals can be achieved. Next slide, please. Okay, so I know that this platform, it doesn't allow for a super interactive format, but I'd love to hear from you about any challenging scenarios that you've encountered and how you handled those, tips or advice for handling challenges, and then any other questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Katie. Yes, we are now going to answer the questions that you submitted. Just to let you know, you can still submit any questions or anything that you have in mind, as Katie said. So we have one question, Katie. One person, Josh was asking, how can client equity be maintained if a certain sponsor wants to help financially in a way that other sponsors cannot? So, for example, pay a few months of rent or extra rent for the family.
Yes, this is a really good question. It's difficult because you don't want to turn down additional support for newcomers. In my experience, we have focused more on trying to kind of match that equity rather than trying to turn down someone's offer. So saying this sponsor wants to do this for this particular client, and then using that as leverage to maybe find another sponsor who's willing to do something similar, talking to the existing sponsor. I love to use sponsors to springboard into other community connections and relationships. So talking to that sponsor about, do you have someone that could match this for this client or this family? Or instead of 4 months for this particular family, could we do 2 months here and 2 months here? So trying to use that to capitalize on additional, there's a word for this in like fundraising, right? Where it's like you take what you have and then you use it to try and grow it and build on something else. So I like to try and do like that. It doesn't always work out that way. And of course, clients, as we know, talk to each other and talk about, this person is getting this and I'm not getting the same thing. But really trying to leverage what sponsors are, the connections that they have, to see if there's another way to do the same thing for another client. But I know that's a really tricky spot to be in.
Thank you so much, Katie. And just for the sake of time, I'm not getting any other questions. So we are going to wrap up today's webinar. Thank you again, Katie, for being with us today. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We would like to take a minute from you. We would like to hear back from you about any feedback on today's webinar and hear your suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics. We ask that you take 1 minute now to complete the survey. The QR code is on the screen, so if you can use your phone to scan it and just leave a survey for us, or you can also follow the link in the chat. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar. And on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you so much for joining us today and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.